Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at Harvard University. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics. Tonight our guest and visiting IOP Fellow is former Congressman Eric Cantor. He currently serves as Vice Chair of the investment bank Moelis & Company, but until 2014, he spent 2 decades in public service. First, serving in the Virginia House of Delegates, and beginning in 2001, representing Virginia's 7th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2008, Congressman Cantor was elected Republican whip, and in 2011, he was elected House Majority Leader of the 112th Congress. Known as a smart and pragmatic legislator, Congressman Cantor called for a vision of conservatism, and I quote, "founded on decency, inspiration, and a desire to let every American have a fair shot at earning their success and achieving their dreams," end quote. Last January, then Congressman Cantor, addressing Congress and the Obama administration, urged both to think about the 8 million children who will be born before the next election and for their sake, forego short-term tactics that gain advantage for 2016 and focus on where they agree and what they can do to create growth and opportunity. We are proud to welcome Eric Cantor back to the forum. Our moderator for tonight's discussion is Shira, the political editor of the Boston Globe. She is an authority on congressional races and elections, appearing frequently as a political analyst on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Shira is a former political editor of Roll Call and was a staff writer for both Politico and National Journal's Hotline. Most importantly, Shira was an IOP Spring Resident Fellow last year. Welcome back, Shira.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you. And welcome to the forum, Congressman.
Great to be back.
Terrific. So I think everyone here probably knows how this works. We're going to chat for about a half an hour, and then we'll take it to questions. So start thinking of your very wise and smart questions right now. So let's talk a little bit about your new job. What exactly are you doing, and how does it relate to being the former House Majority Leader?
Well, first of all, what I'm doing now is I'm, as Maggie indicated, I'm Vice Chairman, Managing Director at Moelis & Company. We are a global but independent investment bank with 17 offices around the world, about 600 employees, just went public last spring. And what we do is we advise CEOs, boards of public companies, in terms of their strategic decision making, whether it is through growth by acquisition, whether it is merging with another entity, and just general decisions on how to conduct affairs. And so in many ways, I'm in the business of giving advice, and if you look to see what I did in my prior role as Majority Leader, I guess one could say it was trying to offer advice in a very friendly way, and if that didn't work, get kind of serious. But I am...
Are you talking about with the speaker or with the caucus?
I am talking about just with members in general, and certainly as, and, you know, sort of cutting my teeth as deputy whip and then whip, trying to affect a certain outcome in one's voting was very much about advice and about learning and helping the education process through advocacy of a cause in terms of a bill. But it is those sort of the intersection, I think, right now, if you look at business today, the one who is allocating capital or in a decision-making capacity has to obviously assess risk. And unfortunately, more and more sectors of our economy are being affected by government action, which increases the unknown, which increases the risk. And so I see a real merging of the two worlds, and now 7 months back in the private sector.
You spoke a little bit, or you alluded to, this idea of short-termism, right, when it comes to decision-making and making deals. What are some examples of short-termism that you see in government versus business today?
Well, if I go back and I look at sort of my career as a elected official in government, I served for about 9 years in the Virginia House and then served for about 14 years in the Congress. And over that period of time, you know, certainly what drew me to that service is, I think, what the Kennedy School and the IOP is about, which is trying to promote public service, trying to promote students who are aspiring to make their way in the world to also make their way in terms of the conduct of our government and our country. So I'm very, very supportive, delighted to be here because I am so energized no matter what side of the philosophical spectrum or party that you're in. The fact that you care enough to want to influence the outcome of the country and its future is really, really a calling that obviously I've spent a lot of my life pursuing. But what I saw in that time in government is, although one who offers himself up for elected office does so with a long-term vision in mind to effect some good, there are forces at work in our electoral system that tend to be much more short-term in nature. I mean, just the very sense of a 2-year term as a member of Congress tends to be something that is countering aspirations towards a long-term view or a long-term goal. And I think similarly in business. I mean, what you're seeing today is increasingly with the technology we have, the availability of information about the performance of a company. If you are on the board or an officer in a publicly traded organization, all of a sudden quarterly reports mean a whole lot. And Wall Street's going to look at you in terms of your performance in that light. That has to have some impact on decision making. And one who is in a leadership position in a company, I think it is imperative for that man or woman, just as it is for one in elected office, to be very definitive in his or her long-term view in order to navigate the short-term pressures that exist both in the business world as well as the political arena. And again, I think that's what largely shapes what leadership is about today, is the ability to maintain a strong view of the future and long-term value while at the same time having the practical ability to do your day job and navigate these short-term pressures.
But in government specifically, in Congress, were there certain issues that you believe suffered from short-termism more than others?
Oh, I can tell you right now on both sides of the aisle, because I think that there's equal opportunity on this. And you know, I'll say on my side of the aisle, immigration has been something that has evaded a lot of solutions have evaded us, and we as a Republican Party have not had a unified position saying, hey, we want to fix this and here's how. So I took the position early on that because anything comprehensive in nature in terms of legislation, and sure you know this, that hasn't always worked out well in Washington. There can be a lot of unintended consequences. So I think like in so many other instances in life, perhaps maybe if it's so complex, maybe you need to break it down into parts and accomplish getting across the goal line, if you will, one by one. So I, for a couple years, felt very strongly that although we couldn't come together on a comprehensive fix, that what you could do was deal with that which we agreed to, which should be the kids. It should be those dreamers. The kids who were brought here by parents, in many cases unbeknownst to that child that they were brought here, were raised in this country, didn't know any other country ever as home. To me, it would make sense to give them citizenship. What else are you going to do? So I felt very strongly about that and wanted to go about passing legislation to that effect. Had a lot of difficulty in convincing some of my colleagues on my side of the aisle that it was something that we should do. And I believe the reason why that there was such resistance is because there was short-term pressure from many interest groups on the right which said even that, dealing with the kids when they themselves did not commit any wrong, didn't break any law, that somehow conferring citizenship on them was amnesty. And the siren of short-termism, the incentive to respond to that there was a lot there for folks to say, you know what, right, I'm not taking any risk. I don't want to be accused of amnesty. I'm staying away from even helping the kids. And I would say on the left, you know, there is a real commitment on the part of some on the far left to say, hey, this system of ours is rigged against us, and that means that the big bad corporations, and I'll say that just in jest, but this is what I believe that the attitude is on the left, to say the bad corporations, you know, they're getting theirs while you're not getting yours. So what is the bill that is purported to be that which safeguards and puts those big banks and corporations in their place? What the left will say is it's Dodd-Frank, and we can't touch Dodd-Frank because that was designed to protect the little person and to put the big banks in their place. Well, honestly, there is no perfect law or legislation. Anything can be improved, and there was instances where one would want to improve Dodd-Frank to make it work better, but yet some on the extreme left would say, we're not touching it, it's sacrosanct. So again, very analogous to what the situation on the right was with this amnesty question when you're dealing with kids that didn't even break the law themselves. So those are two examples, I think, of short-term slogans which many in the advocacy community put out there as a line not to be crossed, but thwarting in the end what's beneficial to everybody. On the immigration side, to say we're a country of laws and a country of immigrants. On the Dodd-Frank financial services side, say we have the most successful, deep, sophisticated capital markets in the world, which helps fuel the growth in our economy.
I just want to ask you one more question about immigration reform. When you lost your primary, some people in my business, the media, wrote that immigration reform was dead. What's the prognosis, in your opinion, for immigration reform? How can Republicans, especially House Republicans, confront this issue in a successful and productive way?
I really think that one needs to take a step back and see what it is that people can agree on together rather than complete gnashing of teeth and not get anywhere. And, you know, the immigration piece is, as I said before, there are short-term pressures against doing anything for fear that someone would be accused of implementing amnesty. So if you know that to be the case, that is the short-term pressure. The point is, incrementally, what can you do ultimately to get to a solution where both sides are going to have to give? So it goes back to this sense, although one has a long-term view, how do you get to that long-term goal? How do you incrementally make progress? And I think that is the key. My sense is right now, very little prospect of that happening until there's a presidential election.
And when you say incrementally, can you maybe give an example of one of the starting points, one of the first
kids.
increment?
Why not start with the kids? And the notion is, if the criticism on the right is amnesty, these kids did not break any laws. It was their parents. If you want to get to the issue, they were the ones in search of a better life. They were the ones who came here or overstayed a visa that brought the kids in. Now, we've got a tradition of law in this country. In fact, it's biblical as well. We don't hold kids liable for the illegal acts of their parents in America. So you can counter the criticism on the right, and at the same time, those who back what the president is trying to do, you can get one step there without getting everything. And I think both sides have to give a little bit. You can't get everything on one side, and you're going to have to start making progress on the other side.
Let's talk a little bit about the guy in the White House, the president. You've been a critic of him in the past, fair to say. You've had a couple confrontations with him, reported confrontations with him, for example, over the stimulus and the debt limit. Did you draw any lessons from these experiences at all when it comes to negotiating and deal making? And secondly, do you think the president suffers from so-called short-termism?
Look, first of all, I think the example of the stimulus debate is actually a pretty instructive about where things have gone since then. It's been well over 6 years now since that debate occurred. And remember what was going on at the time. You know, this was a historic election of the nation's first black president. He was extremely popular at the time with over 70% approval rating, had everything going for him, in addition to the fact that the country had just suffered a tremendous setback with the almost crash of the markets. And this was all post, the mortgage crisis and AIG and Lehman Brothers and the whole thing. And so the president was there to really be in a position to bring the country together. Right before he was sworn in, he asked then Leader Boehner and I to a meeting with the other members of leadership, and he was president-elect. And I recall meeting in the LBJ room in the Senate, and he came over to us and said, the President-elect said, I'm really serious about wanting to work with you. I want us to work together to bring this country back so we can move forward. And he indicated that we should bring him our ideas about what should be and what was reported to be coming, which was a stimulus bill. So after the swearing in, we all went to the White House, met in the Roosevelt room. I guess I was so bold at the time, I brought a white paper to show the president. He said, bring your ideas, and I did that. And the president looked at it initially and said, hey, there's nothing unreasonable, nothing crazy in here, I think he said. And we were very careful not to be crazy in this white paper, because I know that what the assumption was, what Republicans wanted in tax reform and stimulus was not ever going to sell with an Obama White House.
And a white paper, essentially a policy memo.
A policy memo. So unfortunately, what happened was the items on the white paper never made it into a stimulus proposal. And for whatever reason that the White House would explain or not about what should or shouldn't be considered a Republican position in the stimulus bill, nothing on the paper was there. And in the end, the White House did not get any Republican support at all. However many we were strong at the time, no Republicans voted for the bill. And remember, this was when the president had a 70% plus approval rating. There was every indication that we wanted to work together, that he wanted to work with us. So I think when you ask, was there any education, was there a lesson learned there, I hope that the White House would say, and I believe this, if they had taken the time to engage, to interact on a personal level, I believe they could have easily gotten Republican support. Maybe not the majority of Republicans, but they could have gotten Republican support to get off on a much more bipartisan basis. And I would think you carry that through the last 6 years. There is something about human interaction that tends to take the chill off, if you will, or break the ice. And I would jump up and down and tell the White House, I don't care how Rock Red Rib Republican District 1 would have, if you're invited to the White House to have dinner with the President and the First Lady in an intimate setting, you better believe that that member of Congress and his or her spouse is going to be there and will want a picture with the President of the United States and his wife. So that, to me, shows you there's a power in that office, unfortunately, that's not been used to leverage what it is that needs to get done on a policy basis.
So if you were to give the president a grade between A and F on his relations with Congress, I figured D.
I think he's doing pretty badly.
D?
Yes, I
Well,
do. And I
the
think
flip side of that is Joe Biden, right? You
well,
think?
And Joe Biden and I, and this is to the point, Shira, is I actually have a very good relationship with him, and I cringe every time I say that because I'll have to call him and tell him I hope I didn't hurt you by saying that. But I mean, again, we were brought together during the debt ceiling debate, and the president had asked the vice president to sort of host a commission that lasted for about 7 weeks, 3 times a week, 2.5 hours every day. And the speaker at the time, Boehner, asked me to go and sit there with the vice president and his team, and there were others in the cabinet who were there and members. And we actually developed a relationship. And there was a recognition about the political sensitivities. My wife and he and Dr. Jill Biden have seen each other and go out to dinner socially and those kind of things based on that experience. But that's what's missing. It's the human element above all else that in the end of the day could force or at least prompt someone, if they're at all reasonable, into solving problems, risking taking steps that may not be totally what one would want, but in the end of the day could bring people together. And that's, I believe, what's missing.
You know, we've reporters on Capitol Hill have also realized this. The White House, particularly the president, always hasn't been the best at reaching out to members of Congress. Why do you think? What do you think it is about him? Why do you think it's because he didn't serve in Congress for as long as Joe Biden?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a real estate developer. I'm now an investment banker. I am not a psychoanalyst. So
Fair enough.
I don't know. I mean, I just think that, again, the human element is very much missing. And look, the Congress has devolved a lot into that as well. There aren't enough opportunities to interact with one another without cameras being in the way or that. And, in committee and subcommittee, with cameras on, actually, you do get a chance to get to know others. And maybe the more intimate setting of a committee room could help facilitate that, but probably worth some thought.
Let's talk a little bit about 2016. And because we're on the theme of the discussion is about short-termism. Is there anyone in the 2016 field that you think has a proven ability to prioritize long-term decision-making, deal-making? I've seen it, you've said before that you kind of have 4 favorites among the field, right?
I think that, the 2016 election on the Republican side, and I think even the general election, hopefully will be able to result in the election of an individual who can demonstrate that type of leadership, which says, 1, I got a view. I know where I want this country to go. People have elected me to do that. And number 2, back to this other discussion we were having, what's missing with the White House, I've got the ability to practically, on a day-to-day basis, conduct my day job. To make it so that I can get along with people and get things done. And so I do think on the Republican side, I've said before, there are really 4 people who I believe will be one of those which will receive our nomination.
And those were Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, and Scott Walker.
Right.
Which one of those 4 did you last speak to on the phone?
You were going to get me to say something. No.
Sorry, once a reporter, always a reporter.
So I've spoken to all of them recently. I don't want to say which one more recently. Something will be taken from that, and that's not true. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about deal making, and the big deal right now in the news is home state former Senator and Secretary of State John Kerry's negotiations with Iran. Do you think the framework that they've put out, do you think this is a deal for the long term?
I'm really worried about this deal. I'm really worried about the framework that has been proposed, and obviously the sort of meat on the bones comes by June, and several points that concern me. And whether you can sort of count on it in the long term, I'm doubtful. One is the whole question about Iran's breakout capacity. And what and when is that? What is it? What really can be verified about that? And clearly, to allow Iran to have breakout capacity is a danger to us all. So I think, secondly, the nature of the inspection regimes. There's a lot been discussed in the media lately about snap inspections. What will be the inspection regime? And how do you resolve disputes if there is deemed to be a violation of the agreement? Are we in the U.S. going to have to rely on the UN and perhaps Iran's, the countries who are sympathetic to Iran to be able to block any kind of U.S. response? And then what is the response? What is the nature of the reimposition of sanctions? How quickly are sanctions going to be lifted? That's another question that needs to be asked. And I think in the end, this agreement, as the president himself and his administration keep saying, it only deals with the nuclear question. What about all the other destabilizing things that Iran has been undertaking over the last decade or more? Hamas, Hezbollah, what's going on in Iraq, in Syria, what's going on recently with the Houthis in Yemen. All of this can be attributed right back to Tehran. And so if you're going to lift sanctions because somehow there's a determination that Iran has complied with the provisions of this deal, all that does is give Tehran that much more money to go about destabilizing and doing all it can to reach its hegemonic goals in the region. So I'm very, very worried about this deal. I know those who are proponents of it think it's a good long-term thing and a long-term benefit. I'm worried about it.
At the time, or when you were in Congress, you were the sole Republican Jew in Congress, right? At least for a period of time there. I think it's been fascinating to watch Republicans, especially bringing, when John Boehner asked Bibi Netanyahu to come speak to this chamber. What do you think, where do you think the relationship between House and Senate Republicans and Israel is headed at this point? I'd say compared to the other party.
There's no question the trend on the Republican side of the aisle has been clearly on the upswing for support of Israel. I think you are down to low single digits for those who would not necessarily be there on every vote to support Israel. And I think the trend is the opposite on the Democratic side of the aisle. There's been a lot of sympathy towards those who would claim, the Palestinians should right now be given a state. There are those who would advocate in the progressive left in America on this BDS movement, boycott, divestiture, and sanctions against Israel, who support the UN disproportionately going after Israel. I think all of that exists in the left in America. You're not seeing that on the right. Now, there have been on the right indicators that some would say we don't need to be so globally engaged, we don't need to be spending money on foreign aid, et cetera, non-interventionist. I don't think that's anywhere near as prominent on the right as the BDS movement and others on the left. I'm much more concerned about what's going on the left.
Shifting gears quite a bit, I'd like to get your thoughts on the Indiana governor, Mike Pence, and the religious freedom law that just passed in Indiana. The governor, who I should also mention is your former colleague in the House of Representatives for a few terms, has received a lot of backlash from businesses about the law. And I think you might have a unique perspective on this, given your new industry. First, do you think it was a good idea for Mike Pence to go back and Indiana Republicans go back and make changes to the law, or try to make changes?
I think the fact that the changes were made so quickly probably reflected the fact that those who supported the law didn't realize how violent the backlash would be. And, I am always concerned when there is some sense of exclusion that comes out of a public act. We are a country that should be tolerant and is based on tolerance. Again, as you say, Shira, I am a member of a minority religion, and I grew up as a minority in an area that didn't have a lot of Jewish people. And so I understand what it means just in terms of the sensitivities, where if you're in a situation and have a religious service at a school you attend, and all of a sudden you're the odd one out, right? And again, but we as a country have come a long way. We're not perfect in this. And certainly we are built on this notion that you have the ability to practice your religion and there's no imposition of a state religion, but we also have a country that protects people's rights. And the question at the heart of this debate of the Indiana RFRA law, which some would say tracks pretty closely, and I've not read the law to see that it tracks closely to what President Clinton signed and what 20-some other states have. I think some would say that it is licensed to allow people to discriminate based on their sexual preference, and I think that that's wrong. You should not allow anybody to do it. Now, I can't say that that law is or isn't. I think the evidence is in the courts. What have the courts done to say that there is a law in place that is needed to protect one's religious rights? Or has a court ever come in and said, this law is unduly burdensome to one's ability to practice their faith? And I just don't know, again, where the examples are to say that a court would ever come down and say that you shouldn't or you aren't compelled to serve someone because of their sexual preference. Now, I do think this question of a ceremony and the photographer and the intimacy of the ceremony, this is where I think one on the religious freedom side says, well, don't make me do that. I'm not so sure a court agrees with that. I'm really not. So.
I mentioned that Indiana businesses were quite angry with Governor Pence about the law. The alliance between business and the Chamber of Commerce and Christian conservatives, many of whom back the law, is precious to the Republican Party and has been a long-term coalition. Do you see that coalition at risk or threatened? And you've also dealt with this somewhat in the House, where you had a lot of kind of libertarian-leading members at odds with the Chamber of Commerce. Is this coalition at risk?
And the coalition between?
Between Chamber of Commerce, pro-business, and Christian conservatives in the Republican Party.
You know, it's interesting when they say Christian conservatives, and I'm a conservative, and, you know, I'm Jewish, so I was able to, I guess, you know, be in part of both.
Yes.
So, but, you know, I don't think that there's necessarily a bridge that has collapsed. I do think there are some issues, and remember what, you know, are surrounding a lot of the shutdowns and a lot of the libertarians. It was less libertarian and more sort of fiscal hawks, which said we needed to shut down the government because, unfortunately, the country has grown so bad in such a wrong direction, we needed to do something extreme. And then you saw the business community get really upset that at the hands of Republicans, somehow you saw the shutdown of government. And as you know, I was very much in opposition to shutting down the government.
Of course.
I don't think it helped anyone. I don't think it helped the conservative cause at all. I don't think it helped even a limited government cause to do that. So, you know, it is about leadership. I don't think there is any permanent fraying of this coalition that makes up the Republican Party. But if you go back to even the politics on the Democratic side and the left, just like the Republican side, there are different interest groups. I mean, there's things that you have in common. On the Republican side, what we have in common, I believe strongly, is individual empowerment, individual rights. It's not to say the Democratic Party doesn't stand for that as well. We just get there a different way. And, you know, to focus on opportunity afforded through upward mobility. I mean, to me, long term, that's what needed more than anything else is economic opportunity and growth. And it's going to take leadership so we get out of these discussions about fraying here and fraying there. There needs to be a long-term vision. And I do think 2016 gives us that opportunity.
So there's only going to be one question about your primary, and this is it, okay?
Sure.
Looking back, is there anything you would have done differently?
Sure. I think that the mistake made in my primary was the assumption that we had Republicans only voting. You know, Virginia, very unique in states. I don't know how unique. I know other states do have it, but there is an open primary law in Virginia, and the Democratic candidate did not have a primary that day. And in fact, it was later uncovered that my opponent in the primary was actively engaged in recruiting the Democratic voters. And the post-election polling that was done indicated, I think, almost 23,000 Democratic primary voters came into my primary. And whereas I still received the majority of Republican votes, I just didn't receive anywhere near as much as I used to because of a lot of the issues we talked about. My stance on immigration, my stance on keeping the government open, my stance on making sure we didn't go into default as a federal government, my stance in passing the DARP bill. All the things
Sounds so unreasonable.
All things that I feel should have been done, and I wouldn't, if given where I was in those instances, would have taken the same votes now, knowing what I knew then. But again, I think the fault was in the political calculation about who were the voters and who were really coming out to vote that day.
Right. So do you miss Congress at all?
You know, I miss the people. I really do. I mean, you think about being in a place where you work for 14 years and you get to know people and you work and you convene meetings day in and day out. You grow really attached to working with people. I had a great team of people that I work with on my staff as well. Some of whom are here today. One is a fellow here, Matt Lira, who is leading up the digital efforts in terms of the digital age in politics and business. So I've been meeting with him and his students today. John Murray, who is a former fellow, also is here. So I'm able to go and at least continue the contacts and relationships I've got.
All right, fun question for you, and then we'll go to, I think we'll start with questions from the audience. I'm going to make the assumption that you have a little more free time now than you used to, maybe just a little bit. Have you picked up any, for lack of a better word, hobbies? Are you doing anything fun or new? Or do you have a favorite show you watch on Netflix besides House of Cards?
Right. You know, funny, the House of Cards is I'm actually, I'm traveling a lot. Moelis & Company is a global business, and so I'm traveling actually more than I used to travel.
Really?
And because if you recall, as majority leader, you had the ability to help schedule the floor, and you knew when you had to be in Washington, and you knew when you weren't. Now you are really at the call of the clients and the businesses and that you work with. So I will say that the Netflix House of Cards show is probably the #1 question that I'm asked. And especially when you go to countries in Asia and elsewhere who are watching the show thinking, wow. And they're always asked, is it really like that? You know, but no, again, I think that enjoying my next chapter in life.
Excellent. Terrific. Well, we'll start with questions now, and just a couple ground rules, reminders for the questions. All questioners must identify themselves. 1 brief question per person, no speeches, please. He's heard enough of those in Congress, I'm sure. And please end your question with a question mark. As an editor, I very much appreciate that. So let's start over here.
How's it going? My name is Jamarcus. I had a question I'm curious about your thoughts in relation to the Citizens United decision and around $900 million that the Koch brothers are planning on spending for 2016. So I'm wondering, for a typical everyday American, or not even necessarily typical, but a person from a socioeconomically disadvantaged background, do you think that people still have an opportunity to allow their vote to count, even though there's so much money that goes on into politics now?
So I'm going to give you my view on campaign finance first, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what you've alleged in terms of the Koch brothers and influences in politics. First of all, I've always taken the position that you really ought to be transparent in terms of political donations. And I am one who believes strongly that what you do with your money is a lot about sort of your constitutional right to state your position. But if you're going to do that, you have a duty in our country and our system to disclose that you're doing it. And unfortunately, the evolution of the campaign finance laws, McCain-Feingold, Shays-Meehan in the House, and the rest, what it's done is it is increased the opacity of the system so that people are able to give money and hide behind these organizations so that the public doesn't realize who's funding them. You cite sort of Republican donors that are involved. I bet most of the public doesn't know that, and so they're just hearing things blindly. So I do think that there is a problem with the lack of transparency. But when you say, should billionaires who happen to be Republican have the ability to do that, and does that unfairly advantage them over the working people of the country? Remember, you know, the press, and no harm intended, the press has total license to do and opine with whatever they want on politics. And as we know, and I don't think I'm crossing any uncharted ground here, most of the press self-identifies as liberal. Okay? I mean, I don't know, Shira. It's the latest polls I've seen. Most will self-identify, more than half.
Reporters aren't supposed to participate in polls.
Right. Right. But most will most will self-identify. So, and you're human beings. So why is it that one industry has unfettered ability to push out online through ink every day whatever it is he or she may feel, but not necessarily one of us, a company, someone who's wealthy, someone who's poor, right? No one says that they should. So that's why I come back to this. And not to mention, I mean, there's this whole debate about corporate America on the Republican side and the union and labor movement on the Democratic side. And they have all kinds of constitutionally deemed right to organize their members and communicate with their members, unlimited. So it's unfair to single out, say, hey, we got a billionaire Republican, they're having undue influence, because there are a lot of those who have disproportionate influence compared to you and me. So I think the best MO or method should be, let everybody give what they want, but just disclose it. Let people see who's behind a particular candidate, and then they can draw their conclusion.
Thanks.
Next up.
Hi, my name's Peter. I'm in the physics department, and thank you very much for coming. I had in hearing your remarks, you're basically saying it seems like a sort of find ways to compromise, say, with the immigration, and that you can take both sides and look at some common ground, and that, in a way, hyperpolarization or the sort of separation of positions is due to short-termism. But what happens if it's, in fact, the opposite? And I would give the example of the labor relations in the upper Midwest. So we mentioned Governor Walker and the idea that the labor movement comes in and they try to enshrine some of their rights, and then there's a sort of scorched earth battle, and at the end, the result is that the Republican or the conservative position is won, with both Wisconsin and Michigan now being right-to-work states, and that's actually, if it's enshrined in their constitution, quite a long-term solution, right? So there's a case where hyperpolarization actually led through scorched earth to a policy advancement that's about as permanent as it's going to be on the state level. So so I'm sort of wondering sort of what you think about, I mean, there is sort of a relationship. Sometimes compromise might be good, but sometimes hyperpolarization might actually get the policy goal you want in a permanent way.
So I'm not so sure that I would qualify the right-to-work movement as hyperpolarization. And that's essentially what Scott Walker was about and Governor Snyder was about in Michigan, was to reinstate the right-to-work law in those states. It's certainly not in my region of the country would I say that there's a lot of incentive, and I think to the detriment of the right-to-work movement, haven't been very engaged politically. I mean, those states they were. And I think a lot of it had to do with the alleged abuse that was taking place in the public space with the union movement, and there was a backlash. When we talk about, so I do think, I agree with you, right to work is not necessarily short-term sort of pressure. It was much more of a long-term, sort of message, and I think structural issue for the labor situation in those states. But it's where. So, if the budget that we just passed, that we just saw in Congress pass, the budget was only a partisan budget, by and large. It was a Republican budget that balanced in 10 years. Now, that's a very short, although one would say we need balance, and it's good for Republicans to put out their model. That budget's not going to pass. But it was a concession to the short-term imperative to those who don't think Washington is living within its means. But in the end, it's very hard to see the Democratic president solving that problem in that way. It's not going to happen. So at some point, there's going to be a breakdown of those expectations about balancing the budget in 10 years, given the political makeup. And it's this short-term sort of jerk saying, oh, we're there for you. Don't worry. We're going to balance this budget in 10 years. Where at the end of this year, that's not happening. So that breeds a cynicism, and that also, I think, actually gets in the way of long-term. If the goal should be deficit reduction, you do that much more effectively through economic growth. And why can't people rally around the economic growth method rather than stay out here fighting on the polls between balancing the budget within a year and never balancing the budget?
Thank you.
We're going to go up a level.
Hi. Leader Cantor, thank you very much for speaking to us. My name is Alex Jurgen. I'm a student in the joint Harvard-Kennedy School Harvard Business School program. Until recently was the co-president of the Harvard Business School Republicans. My question concerns your home state. The Commonwealth of Virginia has been talked about a lot as a place that was Republican and is trending blue, but we just had, for many people, a surprise where Ed Gillespie did fantastically against Mark Warner in the last election. What do you, to the extent you have peer into your crystal ball, what do you see as the political future of Virginia?
Great question.
I think that Virginia, being a native, lived there all my life, and it is still a center-right state. It's a state that has benefited from a lot of growth, not just in the northern Virginia suburbs around Washington, but in the two metropolitan areas downstate in Richmond and Tidewater. The state's population, if I'm not mistaken, is about 28% northern Virginia, and the rest, 73, 72%, the rest of the state. And you have a fairly significant downstate minority population that tends to vote Democratic. And so if you're going to run statewide in Virginia, you got to run up the middle. And Ed Gillespie was a candidate that really had not been tarnished by any kind of record or statements that he had made in the past that offended those sort of suburban families out there that make up the bulk of the electorate in these major urban areas. And unfortunately was unable to get over the line. I think Mark Warner, you know, if you remember, he campaigned as the quote-unquote radical centrist. And that again says, you know, a lot about what the statewide electorate is. But unfortunately, and I think part of the analysis looking back at that race, while some who say that Warner was unable to generate enthusiasm in the Democratic base, was because he didn't go off into the extreme. And when you listen to some of the extreme populism we talked about before in terms of the Dodd-Frank insistence and all that, and about the big bad corporations, business, and everything else being against you, you didn't hear Mark Warner saying that. So again, maybe there is some sense that that's what generates the enthusiasm on the base on the Democratic side. I don't know. But the fact that he stayed and said, I'm a radical centrist, also, I think, reflects his notion of what that state is. And the fact that Ed Gillespie really was a center-right candidate also attributed to his really good performance in that race, although not enough.
Hello, Congressman. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ignacio. I'm a freshman at the college. I had a question relating about the future of the Republican Party. Specifically, what do you think it is, and what do you think it is regarding social issues? Will the lines with issues such as immigration or LGBT rights begin to blur between parties? Will the Republicans hold steadfast on their current views, or will they be dragged by court decisions such as future Supreme Court decisions?
So I would say first on the immigration issue, I'm not so sure that the courts are going to be able to resolve that. I think the Congress will have to resolve it. My sense is it will be resolved after the next election. I think the time has come and it will be resolved. And again, for a lot of the reasons we talked about earlier. On the question of gay marriage in particular, I think the courts have dragged the Republican Party or the situation in this country back to the state level, and that those issues pretty much being resolved at the state level. I would say that there is plenty of room for diversity in both parties. And just to claim there is a monolith Republican position, I'm not so sure that that in the end is what will be, because there are some very, you take the life issue on abortion. There are some really heartfelt religious convictions that a lot of us have on either side of the issue, that you're not going to deny people those convictions. But again, I think it's a question of tolerance and a question of the culture and sort of breeding that sense of tolerance and how that sort of intersects with the politics. But no question, when I was majority leader, spent a lot of time on focusing on the question of women participation and support in the Republican Party, as well as minority participation and support.
Hi, my name is Sally. I'm a freshman in the college. And I'm wondering, kind of piggybacking off of that question, what do you think is the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of the Republican Party going into 2016?
I think it is really the Republican Party's year to the race to lose, because I think that the country, I think we've seen when there is a president in office for 8 years, whether it's this president or the prior one, country gets kind of tired of it. And I think that there is a lot of weariness on the part of the electorate right now and things that have gone on with this administration, that America likes to change. And some in the Republican circles say, well, we tried that, hope and change, look how that worked. But I do think that this country does look forward. It likes to change, a new generation, I think there is a lot of sense to that right now in the electorate. So there is a strength just electorally. There has been a real collapse in confidence on the part of the working middle class in this country. We've been well reported You look at the lack of wage growth as we begin to see a little bit of economic growth, although there's a hiccup in these last set of numbers. You really haven't seen the kind of wage growth that we need for the low-skilled and then up in terms of the wage earner. So there is something an advantage to be gained by the Republican Party to say, look, we've had in place one party now for 8 years, and look what's happened. There's been no wage growth. Let's try our way. So I do think that that's a strength. Obviously, the weakness and where my party has to focus is how do we expand the appeal? How do we go about an electoral college map with some very large states that are going to be impacted by minority votes? And we've not been very successful at that over the last couple cycles. I think some of the candidates that Shira mentioned before actually have the ability to appeal to those constituencies.
You're next.
Hi, Mr. Cantor. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Happy Yang. I'm a junior at the college. Today in the forum, we spoke a lot about short-term and long-term in politics. So as you start your next chapter on Wall Street, what's your personal short-term and long-term goal?
You're going to try and make news just like Shira. I'm also a father. I've got 3 who are probably most of the students here's age, and my long-term goal is to make sure I do what I can. I've been in public office for a long time and had a wife who's been a career-oriented person and has been doing most of the heavy lifting as far as the future sustainability economically of my family. So I'm very engaged in that effort of the economic security of the Cantor family. But I think long term, I care about this country. I care about the role that the country plays for all of us, but also the role the country plays globally. And as I mentioned before, I'm getting to travel a lot internationally, and I see, both from a business perspective as well as a geopolitical perspective, there's a real need for American leadership. I mean, you look what's going on in Asia right now, in the competitiveness and the environment there with, China on the rise and the, prospects for, increased interaction between that region of the Asia Pacific and where we are in Europe. What kind of rules and the norm are we going to abide by? And that's why it gets me back to really caring about the trade issues. Nothing I think is more important right now than to see a completion of these trade agreements so we can establish some type of international law and norms that we're used to, that the other countries that we are allied with are used to in terms of conducting business and protecting rights. So, and human rights as well as every other right. So I care about it, and I plan long-term to stay engaged.
So are you planning to stay involved in politics from the Wall Street perspective?
Well, I am, I would say that I've been given a great opportunity to join a firm that's very new. The firm, Moelis & Company, I've joined is only about 8 years old, very entrepreneurial, very much about trying to solve problems. And, you say Wall Street, but this firm is positioned at the essence of what I think makes our economy what it is. It is entrepreneurial. So I look forward to the opportunity of being at this investment bank, helping people grow their businesses, expand their businesses, and ultimately growing an economy that helps everybody.
Thank you.
Up there, please.
Hello, my name is Patrick. Thanks for the talk. If you could require President Obama to read one book, what would it be?
Ooh.
Wow.
These Harvard kids are smart.
Right. I was going to say one, but God, I'm afraid of the interpretation if I say that.
Say that one. That's the one you should go with.
All right, I'll say The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. So, because, I just feel like, although, again, I've read Ayn Rand, and I've read, not all her books, but I've read that, and Atlas Shrugged, and there is just this sense in those books that I think somehow could do a lot to bring the sort of philosophy a little bit back the other way. I'd also ask him probably to go read the Dale Carnegie How to Win Friends and Influence People. So,
Excellent. All right, up there, please.
Jay Gleason. Why are you so quote-unquote concerned about the democratic initiative represented by the BDS movement? It's a long overdue attempt to ensure some belated justice for Palestine. It's a very welcome democratic initiative, isn't it? Along with doing the utmost that you can to defeat AIPAC-backed candidates in congressional districts.
No, I disagree wholeheartedly. I think the BDS movement is absolutely misplaced. I think it's wrong. I think, for one, to sit here and equate what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians to somehow equate the position of when you've got rockets incoming, killing innocent people. If you've been to Stay Road and you've seen it, and you know, there's this saying that says if the Palestinians would put down their arms, there could be peace. If the Israelis put down their arms, there'd be no more Israel. And I think it's as simple as that. And you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you know, he's out there in a very forceful way saying, if there were a partner in peace, we could make some progress. But you don't have, in the Palestinians, anyone who's willing to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That's the problem. You don't have anybody on the other side of the table even recognizing your existence. How are you going to get agreement?
The problem
So
is
that's why
occupation.
I've been such a strong supporter of the security of Israel. And until the time where there is an opponent or a partner for peace on the other side of the table, I think the American public will back the position that I take.
Sorry, one comment per person. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Mr. Cantor. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior at the college. There are a number of us here from a class about the political divide, the growing divide between the left and right. Given your long tenure in Congress, have you noticed the divide growing? And if so, how has that made your job more difficult, or what strategies have you used in order to kind of combat this growing divide between left and right?
It's good. It's a good question. I think very apropos here at Harvard, because as I had a discussion with I think the dean here, he said it's great to be part of an institution whose mission is to solve problems. Yeah. So, yes, I think that the divide has intensified. I don't know if it's grown, it's intensified. I think some of that, and Shira, I'm not going to lump you into this, some of that is partly due to the press and the fragmentation of the press, the ability for all of us to access the kind of news we want and the perspective that we want to hear. And in many cases, constituents of these members of Congress, they choose to watch news or read news that matches their own views. So there's if you take that and put it in its extreme, how much are you going to have in common with one another? You know, so I just think that there's become a very, the game has been upped, if you will, in terms of advocacy, and a lot of times advocacy is confused with the news. So yes, and how do you go about combating that? And I think that goes to the topic of today's discussion. It is about leadership that is committed to a long-term goal that we all can get around. And I used to start, you know, weekly caucus meetings that we'd have with the Republican conference, and I'd put a slide up on the screen which would ask the question, how is what we're doing this week on the floor in the chamber helping the people who sent us here? And if both sides could agree that that should be the goal, then we could disagree all day long on the different methods to best help. But at least we're saying that we're here to reflect that notion of helping people in terms of being elected leaders. And so I do think it takes leadership committed to that long-term view. I think it takes a practical ability, again, I said, to do your day job, to understand when those pressures come, but not succumb to the siren of short-termism.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions. You're up.
Thank you, Congressman Brandon from the business school across the river. You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons that President Obama faced so much resistance was what you perceive as a lack of we'll call it the personal touch. But then the almost unanimous rejection of most of the policies that he put forward suggested to me that even Dale Carnegie would be hard-pressed to have dinner with that many people in order to build those connections. So I was wondering if you had any advice, perhaps if we find ourselves in a situation where we're facing people who are objecting to our policies or advocacies, maybe not solely on the merits thereof, but more kind of a perverse incentive structure.
You're absolutely right. I think the response in time that what has happened is the Republicans in Congress took the view that they were, motivated more than anything else than just to stop the president. And I know that. I know that. I saw that there was probably nothing more galvanizing in many instances for our party than to be against what the president is or isn't for. So, or is for. So I think the point is well made. But I don't think it's hopeless, because I do think starting today, if he were starting to invite members one by one, in couples, 4 by 4, to try and make something work for the last, 16 months of his term, he ought to be doing that. And so when you say, well, what do you do when you're faced with someone who is just going to reject you just for who you are? It's tough. It's tough. But I also have seen the difference in the business world is, people are less quick to adapt that kind of mentality because you have a mutuality of interest in trying to do a deal or trying to, close a transaction or whatever it is. And I think that's what you're going to, in everyday life outside the political arena, you're going to have people who are a lot more reasonable because they have a shared end. But in the political arena, we've got to work to sort of create that shared end again.
Mr. Cantor, thank you very much for your service and for being here. And going back to your theme about the trade-offs between
Would you
kind of
please
short-term.
identify yourself first?
I'm sorry, my name is Jim Sheriff, and I am a fellow in the Advanced Leadership Initiative. Going back to your theme of short-term versus long-term, if you look at so many of the long-term challenges we have, Social Security reform, Medicare reform, the things that could, the debt, with our current form of government, are we ever going to be able to solve it, or is it time to actually call a constitutional convention and do something a little bit more radical to fine-tune our Constitution to work better on long-term issues?
First of all, I would be, just take note of the law of unintended consequences if you call a constitutional convention. So let's just leave that at that. But no, I think that there will be some prospects after this election. The problem has been in Washington. There really are two fundamental differences that the divide has not been bridged, and they have to do with how you fund the government, taxes, and how you expend or spend the entitlement monies. And on the one hand, the tax question has always been the president feels, much like we talked before in this very populist notion that you got to raise taxes on the rich, they're not paying enough. Republicans say no new taxes. And then on the side of spending, the disproportionate cause of the deficit, as we know, is the entitlements because of the demographics in the country and the connection with health care costs. And the Republicans have always said, since '09, that what we would say is transition from a defined benefit plan to a more defined contribution plan. In other words, have beneficiaries over time of Medicare take more of the risk, not just have the government or taxpayers do it. And of course, the Democrats respond, the president says, well, that changes the nature of the safety net, we're not doing it. Boom. And so those two things, that's why you can't get agreement over the deficit. That's when you have things like the transportation bill coming up, unless you decide to fund it and incur more debt, like they did with the SGR bill a couple weeks ago, the healthcare reimbursement bill. Unless they do that, there'll be a short-term Band-Aid fix at best. But I do think over time, so it's been about 6 years since the Ryan budget was first put forward, and I think over time there's been some willingness on the part of some Democrats to listen to it, as have there been some Republicans willing to listen to closure of some loopholes on the tax issues. So I think over time we'll get there, but it's frustrating and you got to be patient, and I'm not patient. So yes, yeah, it's been. I understand why the frustration. So.
All right, up there, please.
Good evening, Mr. Cantor. My name is Scott. Thanks again for coming tonight and spending time with us in the forum. I'm a joint degree master's candidate with the business school and the Kennedy School, and a former military officer. My question.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. My question involves leadership and in the private and public sector, and specifically any differences that you see as kind of key to being an effective leader in the two. To more get at my question, what advice would you give, based on your experience in Washington, to your current colleagues at Moelis? And then on the flip side, what advice would you give your former colleagues in Washington, based on your business experience?
Okay. So this is probably the most obvious example of the difference. So when you're a leader in Congress, you are a leader of members who have basically their own bosses at home. So each member of Congress represents about 750,000 people. And although you would hope that they would have sort of a sense that if they go to Washington and are able to accomplish something as a team, they could go back and sort of explain what has happened for the benefit of the people that sent them there. Often there are, because of the short-term pressures and reward system that has developed, there's not as much incentive. In fact, there is perhaps a stronger draw to go off on your own and to buck what it is leadership says that they should be doing. So whereas in the private sector, you've got direct accountability. People don't have the incentive. In fact, there's a huge disincentive to not follow what it is leadership has set as policy in the firm if you want to stay there. So that's sort of the differences. What would I advise my colleagues and partners at Moelis about the experience I had in Washington? You know, I go a variety of different ways with the answer to this. You know, it's one of the things that I think it is really, I hear so much in terms of our clients and others with disbelief about the lack of functionality in Washington. And, you know, it's almost as if I want to say, look, let me try and explain it to you. They're not all, you know, dysfunctional. There's just so much there, you know, it's a complexity that has just gained so much ground. And we just got to be patient. Don't give up. Don't give up on this system. Because you know, again, having traveled a bit, I don't see any better. And we just, you know, there's so much good about this country. Don't give up. I think that's the advice I would give on the side to my new partners at Moelis. And for my former colleagues, I would say listen before you talk. Because, you know, what I've seen is you know, and listen, I was there for 14 years, and I've now been out since, in this new position since September. I can tell you, I had the rhetoric down pretty good. And again, I was an entrepreneur and a businessman, and I understood what it meant to go and really, literally be the entrepreneur to sign the note at the bank and have to make the repayments, and make payroll, and pay taxes, and pay benefits. So I get that. But it is so easy for that rhetoric to fall off your tongue in theory versus what really happens to make things work in practice. And I probably knew this then, but just not as clearly as I know now. Listen before you talk, because you can learn something.
Final question.
Hello. Congressman Cantor, thank you for coming. My name is Ray Fung, and I'm a Harvard graduate. So we've heard you express vividly your distaste for President Obama several times during this forum. However, you've been a congressman since the year 2001. So my question to you is there anything that either the Bush administration or the Republican Party in general could have done starting from 2001 such that they could have won the election in 2008 and therefore Barack Obama would never have become president in the first place?
You know, I think I alluded to this before. I think the biggest challenge for the Republican Party is to be one of inclusion, not exclusion, and to welcome a diversity of demographic into our fold. And that means we've got to stress policies that speak to a broad swath of the public. That means we have to be sensitive to those who may not feel that they're necessarily welcome into the mainstream of this country. And I think that that's probably what we could have done early on. It still remains even more important today.
Well, I'd like to thank Congressman Cantor for joining us in the forum tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Period of time, you know, certainly what drew me to that service is, I think, what the Kennedy School and the IOP is about, which is trying to promote public service, trying to promote students who are aspiring to make their way in the world to also make their way in terms of the conduct of our government and our country. So I'm very, very supportive, delighted to be here because I am so energized no matter what side of the philosophical spectrum or party that you're in. The fact that you care enough to want to influence the outcome of the country and its future is really, really a calling that obviously I've spent a lot of my life pursuing. But what I saw in that time in government is, although one who offers himself up for elected office does so with a long-term vision in mind to effect some good, there are forces at work in our electoral system that tend to be much more short-term in nature. I mean, just the very sense of a two-year term as a member of Congress tends to be something that is countering aspirations towards a long-term view or a long-term goal. And I think similarly in business. I mean, what you're seeing today is increasingly with the technology we have, the availability of information about the performance of a company. If you are on the board or an officer in a publicly traded organization, all of a sudden quarterly reports mean a whole lot. And Wall Street's going to look at you in terms of your performance in that light. That has to have some impact on decision making. And one who is in a leadership position in a company, I think it is imperative for that man or woman, just as it is for one in elected office, to be very definitive in his or her long-term view in order to navigate the short-term pressures that exist both in the business world as well as the political arena. And again, I think that's what largely shapes what leadership is about today, is the ability to maintain a strong view of the future and long-term value while at the same time having the practical ability to do your day job and navigate these short-term pressures.
But in government specifically, in Congress, were there certain issues that you believe suffered from short-termism more than others?
Oh, I can. Which safeguards and puts those big banks and corporations in their place. What the left will say is it's Dodd-Frank, and we can't touch Dodd-Frank because that was designed to protect the little person and to put the big banks in their place. Well, honestly, there is no perfect law or legislation. Anything can be improved, and there was instances where one would want to improve Dodd-Frank to make it work better, but yet some on the extreme left would say, we're not touching it, it's sacrosanct. So again, very analogous to what the situation on the right was with this amnesty question when you're dealing with kids that didn't even break the law themselves. So those are two examples, I think, of short-term slogans which many in the advocacy community put out there as a line not to be crossed, but thwarting in the end what's beneficial to everybody. On the immigration side, to say we're a country of laws and a country of immigrants. On the Dodd-Frank financial services side, say we have the most successful, deep, sophisticated capital markets in the world, which helps fuel the growth in our economy.
I just want to ask you one more question about immigration reform. When you lost your primary, some people in my business, the media, wrote that immigration reform was dead. What's the prognosis, in your opinion, for immigration reform? How can Republicans, especially House Republicans, confront this issue in a successful and productive way?
I really think that one needs to take a step back and see what it is that people can agree on together rather than complete gnashing of teeth and not get anywhere. And, you know, the immigration piece is, as I said before, there are short-term pressures against doing anything for fear that someone would be accused of implementing amnesty. So if you know that to be the case, that is the short-term pressure. The point is, incrementally, what can you do ultimately to get to a solution where both sides are going to have to give? So it goes back to this sense, although one has a long-term view, how do you get to that long-term goal? How do you incrementally make progress? And I think that is the key. My sense is right now, very little prospect of that happening until there's a presidential election.
And when you say incrementally, can you maybe give an example of one of the starting points, one of the first increment? So start thinking of your very wise and smart questions right now. So let's talk a little bit about your new job. What exactly are you doing, and how does it relate to being the former House Majority Leader?
Well, first of all, what I'm doing now is I'm, as Maggie indicated, I'm Vice Chairman, Managing Director at Moelis & Company. We are a global but independent investment bank with 17 offices around the world, about 600 employees, just went public last spring. And what we do is we advise CEOs, boards of public companies, in terms of their strategic decision making, whether it is through growth by acquisition, whether it is merging with another entity, and just general decisions on how to conduct affairs. And so in many ways, I'm in the business of giving advice, and if you look to see what I did in my prior role as Majority Leader, I guess one could say it was trying to offer advice in a very friendly way, and if that didn't work, get kind of serious. I am... Are
you talking about with the Speaker or with the caucus?
I am talking about just with members in general, and certainly as, you know, sort of cutting my teeth as Deputy Whip and then Whip, trying to affect a certain outcome in one's voting was very much about advice and about learning and helping the education process through advocacy of a cause in terms of a bill. But it is those sort of the intersection, I think, right now, if you look at business today, the one who is allocating capital or in a decision-making capacity has to obviously assess risk. And unfortunately, more and more sectors of our economy are being affected by government action, which increases the unknown, which increases the risk. And so I see a real merging of the two worlds, and now 7 months back in the private sector.
You spoke a little bit, or you alluded to, this idea of short-termism, right, when it comes to decision-making and making deals. What are some examples of short-termism that you see in government versus business today?
Well, if I go back and I look at sort of my career as an elected official in government, I served for about 9 years in the Virginia House and then served for about 14 years in the Congress. And over that period, I can tell you right now on both sides of the aisle, because I think that there's equal opportunity on this. And you know, I'll say on my side of the aisle, immigration has been something that has evaded a lot of solutions have evaded us, and we as a Republican Party have not had a unified position saying, hey, we want to fix this and here's how. So I took the position early on that because anything comprehensive in nature in terms of legislation, and sure you know this, that hasn't always worked out well in Washington. There can be a lot of unintended consequences. So I think like in so many other instances in life, perhaps maybe if it's so complex, maybe you need to break it down into parts and accomplish getting across the goal line, if you will, one by one. So I, for a couple years, felt very strongly that although we couldn't come together on a comprehensive fix, that what you could do was deal with that which we agreed to, which should be the kids. It should be those dreamers. The kids who were brought here by parents, in many cases unbeknownst to that child that they were brought here, were raised in this country, didn't know any other country ever as home. To me, it would make sense to give them citizenship. What else are you going to do? So I felt very strongly about that and wanted to go about passing legislation to that effect. Had a lot of difficulty in convincing some of my colleagues on my side of the aisle that it was something that we should do. And I believe the reason why that there was such resistance is because there was short-term pressure from many interest groups on the right which said even that, dealing with the kids when they themselves did not commit any wrong, didn't break any law, that somehow conferring citizenship on them was amnesty. And the siren of short-termism, the incentive to respond to that, there was a lot there for folks to say, you know what, right, I'm not taking any risk. I don't want to be accused of amnesty. I'm staying away from even helping the kids. And I would say on the left, you know, there is a real commitment on the part of some on the far left to say, hey, this system of ours is rigged against us, and that means that the big bad corporations, and I'll say that just in jest, but this is what I believe that the attitude is on the left, to say the bad corporations, you know, they're getting theirs while you're not getting yours. So what is the bill that is purported to be that?
Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at Harvard University. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics. Tonight our guest and visiting IOP Fellow is former Congressman Eric Cantor. He currently serves as Vice Chair of the investment bank Moelis & Company, but until 2014, he spent 2 decades in public service. First, serving in the Virginia House of Delegates, and beginning in 2001, representing Virginia's 7th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2008, Congressman Cantor was elected Republican whip, and in 2011, he was elected House Majority Leader of the 112th Congress. Known as a smart and pragmatic legislator, Congressman Cantor called for a vision of conservatism, and I quote, founded on decency, inspiration, and a desire to let every American have a fair shot at earning their success and achieving their dreams, end quote. Last January, then Congressman Cantor, addressing Congress and the Obama administration, urged both to think about the 8 million children who will be born before the next election and for their sake, forego short-term tactics that gain advantage for 2016 and focus on where they agree and what they can do to create growth and opportunity. We are proud to welcome Eric Cantor back to the forum. Our moderator for tonight's discussion is Shira, the political editor of the Boston Globe. She is an authority on congressional races and elections, appearing frequently as a political analyst on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Shira is a former political editor of Roll Call and was a staff writer for both Politico and National Journal's Hotline. Most importantly, Shira was an IOP Spring Resident Fellow last year. Welcome back, Shira.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you. And welcome to the forum, Congressman.
Great to be back.
Terrific. So I think everyone here probably knows how this works. We're going to chat for about a half an hour, and then we'll take it to questions.